when a stray dog begins barking outside a police station. Officers follow it, discovering a life-or-death situation that only the dog could have known about. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun cast long shadows across the brick facade of the Maplewood Police Department as Detective Jake Harmon pulled into his usual parking spot. The lot was half empty, typical for the early shift. He grabbed his coffee from the cup holder, noting the steam still rising through the lid. Black, no sugar, just like every other morning for the past 8 years. Inside the precinct, the familiar scent of coffee and cleaning supplies filled the air. Jake nodded to Officer Rodriguez at the front desk, while scanning through the night shift's reports on his phone. Nothing unusual, a couple of drunk and disorderly calls, a minor fender bender on Main Street, and a noise complaint from the apartment complex on Cedar Avenue. The bullpen buzzed with the usual morning activity. Detective Lisa Tran was already at her desk, surrounded by stacks of case files. She looked up as Jake approached, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her blazer draped over her chair. "Morning, Harmon," she said, sliding a file across her desk. "Got another animal complaint from Mrs. Henderson on Oak Street. Says there's a pack of strays causing trouble in her garden." Jake couldn't help but smile. His colleagues often joked about his unofficial role as the precinct's animal whisperer. Last month, he'd helped relocate a family of raccoons from the high school gymnasium. The month before that, he'd rescued a cat stuck in the bell tower of the old church. "Mrs. Henderson thinks everything is causing trouble in her garden," Jake replied, picking up the file. "Remember the Great Squirrel Conspiracy of 2023? Lisa rolled her eyes. "How could I forget? She wanted us to dust her bird bath for fingerprints." Jake settled at his desk, boots propped on the edge as he reviewed the morning briefings. The familiar routine was interrupted by a sound that cut through the usual office noise. A dog barking, persistent and urgent. At first, everyone tried to ignore it. Stray dogs weren't uncommon in Maplewood, especially near the dumpsters behind the local diner. But this barking was different. It wasn't the typical "I'm hungry" or "I'm lost" bark that Jake had heard countless times before. There was something almost deliberate about it. After 5 minutes of continuous barking, Officer Chen walked over to the window. "That dog's right at our front door. Looks like some kind of mixed breed. Pretty scraggly." Jake stood up, something in his gut telling him to pay attention. He'd learned to trust those instincts over the years. They'd helped him solve cases that others had written off as unsolvable. Lisa watched him grab his jacket. "You're not seriously going out there, are you? We've got that briefing with the captain in 20 minutes. "Something's not right," Jake said, already heading for the door. "That dog's trying to tell us something." Lisa sighed but followed him, grabbing her service weapon from her desk drawer. Standard procedure, even for something as seemingly trivial as checking on a stray dog. Outside, the morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wet pavement. The dog, a medium-sized mutt with patches of brown and white fur, stopped barking the moment it saw them. Its intelligent eyes fixed on Jake, and its tail began to wag, not in friendship but in urgency. The dog took a few steps toward them, then looked back over its shoulder, clearly wanting them to follow. Its fur was matted in places, and Jake could see its ribs. This wasn't someone's pet that had just gotten loose. "This is ridiculous," Lisa muttered, but her hand stayed near her weapon. Like Jake, she'd learned that in Maplewood, sometimes the strangest calls led to the biggest cases. The dog barked once more, then turned and started trotting down Wilson Street, constantly looking back to make sure they were following. Jake and Lisa exchanged glances before falling into step behind it. As they moved away from the precinct, the well-maintained storefronts of downtown Maplewood gave way to the industrial district. The dog led them past closed factories and empty parking lots, remnants of the city's more prosperous days. The morning traffic faded into the distance, replaced by an eerie quiet that made both detectives increasingly alert. Every step took them further from the heart of their jurisdiction and closer to the abandoned warehouse district, an area that had been giving the department headaches for years. The dog moved with purpose, as if it knew exactly where it was going. Whatever was driving this animal to seek out law enforcement, Jake was certain it wasn't just about finding its next meal. There was intelligence in those eyes, and more importantly, there was fear. They were about to discover just how right Jake's instincts were, but neither detective could have predicted how this morning would change not only their lives, but the entire fabric of Maplewood's community. The dog stopped in front of a massive steel door, partially hidden behind overgrown weeds. The warehouse loomed above them, its windows either boarded up or broken, creating a patchwork of shadows and filtered light. The building's faded sign read, Maplewood Industrial Storage, EST, 1962. Jake pulled out his phone, sending their location to dispatch, while Lisa scanned the perimeter. Years of police work had taught them both that backup should always be notified before entering any abandoned structure, especially in this part of town. Movement. Second floor, Lisa whispered, gesturing toward a broken window where a shadow had just passed. The dog's ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in its throat. Jake drew his weapon, keeping it pointed downward. Dispatch, this is Detective Harmon. We're at the old Maplewood Industrial Storage Facility, requesting backup for a possible 10 to 31. His voice was barely above a whisper as he gave the code for a crime in progress. The crackling response came immediately. Copy that, Detective. Units are en route. ETA, 5 minutes. A muffled scream pierced the morning air, followed by the sound of breaking glass. The dog's growl intensified, and before either detective could react, it squeezed through a gap in the door's rusted bottom panel. We can't wait, Lisa said, already moving toward a side entrance. Jake nodded, falling into step beside her. They'd worked together long enough to read each other's movements, communicating without words as they approached the door. The lock had been broken recently. Fresh scratch marks marred the metal around the handle. Jake tested the door. It opened with a slight creak. Both detectives winced at the sound, but the noise inside the warehouse, shuffling feet, urgent whispers, and what sounded like duct tape being pulled from a roll, covered their entrance. The interior was a maze of old shipping containers and forgotten machinery. Dust motes danced in the rays of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. The air smelled of rust, mold, and something else. Something metallic that made Jake's stomach turn. Blood. They moved silently through the warehouse, weapons ready. The dog was nowhere in sight, but they could hear voices now, clearer and more distinct. 3, maybe 4 different people, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. The buyers getting impatient. A male voice hissed, "We need to move her now. She's seen our faces." Another voice responded, "That complicates things." Lisa caught Jake's eye and held up 3 fingers, then pointed to their left. Through a gap in the stacked containers, they could see movement. The dog suddenly appeared at the end of the aisle, its tail straight and rigid. It locked eyes with Jake for a moment before disappearing again around the corner. The detectives advanced, using the containers for cover. As they got closer, they could see 3 men gathered around a young woman bound to a chair. She couldn't have been more than 20, her mascara streaked with tears, her business attire suggesting she'd been taken on her way to work. One of the men was holding a phone, pacing as he spoke in angry whispers. Another stood guard by a door, an automatic weapon held casually in his hands. The third was securing the girl's bonds. Checking the duct tape that covered her mouth, Lisa tapped Jake's shoulder and pointed upward. A metal catwalk ran above the scene, offering a potential tactical advantage. Jake shook his head. The rusted structure would never hold their weight without giving them away. The dog, however, had other plans. It emerged from behind a stack of pallets, growling loud enough to draw everyone's attention. The man with the phone spun around, cursing. Where the hell did that come from? The guard raised his weapon, but before he could aim, the The dog lunged forward, snapping at his legs. The man stumbled backward, crashing into a stack of empty boxes. It was the distraction they needed. Lisa emerged from cover, weapon raised. "Police, drop your weapons." Jake moved to flank the suspects, cutting off their escape route. "Hands where we can see them." For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the dog's continued growling and the muffled whimpers of the bound woman. Then everything happened at once. The guard recovered his balance and swung his weapon toward Lisa. The man with the phone dove behind a container. The third suspect reached for something in his jacket. The dog launched itself at the guard's arm, teeth sinking into flesh. The automatic weapon clattered to the ground as the man screamed. Jake tackled the suspect, reaching into his jacket, while Lisa kept her weapon trained on the fallen guard. But the man with the phone had disappeared into the maze of containers, leaving behind only the echo of running footsteps and a shouted promise. "This isn't over." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The cavalry was coming, but Jake knew this was just the beginning. The suspects' parting words weren't just an empty threat. They were a promise that Maplewood's peaceful facade was about to be shattered. The dog sat calmly now, watching as Jake and Lisa secured the suspects. Its work, for the moment, was done. But something in its intelligent eyes suggested it knew, just as the detectives did, that this was only the first chapter in a much larger story. The backup units swarmed the warehouse, their tactical lights cutting through the dusty air. Detective Lisa Tran supervised as officers secured the perimeter, while Jake worked with the paramedics attending to the young woman. Her name was Sarah Chen, a junior accountant at Maplewood Financial Services. "They grabbed me from the parking garage," Sarah explained, her voice shaky as a paramedic checked her vitals. "I was early for work, around 6:30. They knew my schedule, knew I'd be alone." She wrapped the shock blanket tighter around her shoulders, knuckles white from gripping the fabric. Jake noticed the dog hadn't left Sarah's side since they'd freed her. It sat alertly beside the ambulance, eyes constantly scanning the area. One of the paramedics tried to shoo it away, but Jake intervened. "Let him stay. He's the reason we found her." Inside the warehouse, the evidence response team was documenting everything. Lisa coordinated with them, her tablet in hand as she catalogued each discovery. "Jake," she called out, waving him over, "you need to see this." On a makeshift desk made from old pallets, they found detailed surveillance photos of multiple women, all young professionals like Sarah. Each photo had dates, schedules, and routes marked with precise notation. This wasn't an opportunistic crime. It was a carefully planned operation. "They've been watching them for weeks," Lisa said, spreading out the photos. "Look at the timestamps. They knew exactly when each target would be most vulnerable." The guard they'd captured, now handcuffed and waiting for transport, suddenly started laughing. "You have no idea what you're stepping into," he sneered. "This goes deeper than you can imagine." Before either detective could respond, the dog growled, silencing the man. Jake noticed something he hadn't before, a small tattoo on the guard's wrist, partially hidden by his sleeve. It was a simple design, 3 interlocked circles with a line through them. "Book him," Jake told the uniformed officers. "I want every detail about that tattoo documented." Sarah's statement revealed more disturbing details. They kept talking about the buyer and something about a network. "They said I was premium merchandise because of my banking background." Her voice broke, and the dog immediately pressed closer to her leg, offering silent comfort. Captain Martinez arrived on scene, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. "This is bigger than we thought," he said, pulling Jake and Lisa aside. "FBI's been tracking similar cases up and down the coast. They're sending agents." "The suspect who escaped," Lisa interjected. "He knew our procedures, the way he moved through the warehouse, how he avoided our standard containment positions. He's had law enforcement training." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "An inside source, could be," Martinez agreed grimly. "From now on, This investigation stays between us three and the FBI. Trust no one else." A commotion near the warehouse entrance drew their attention. Crime scene technicians were calling for assistance. They'd found a hidden room behind one of the shipping containers, and its contents made the human trafficking angle even more sinister. The room was set up like a documentation center, with high-end camera equipment and professional lighting. But what caught Jake's eye was a laptop, still running, its screen displaying a sophisticated encrypted messaging system. "They were preparing her for auction," Lisa said quietly, her usual professional detachment slipping. "They photograph the victims, create profiles, and sell them to the highest bidder." The dog, which had followed them into the room, suddenly became agitated. It barked once, sharp and urgent, then ran to a corner where a ventilation grate was slightly ajar. Jake pulled it open, revealing a stack of passports, all with different names but the same photos of various women. "Professional forgers," Martinez observed. "They provide new identities for the victims after sale, make them disappear completely." Sarah, who had insisted on helping identify potential victims from the surveillance photos, suddenly gasped. "That's Jessica," she pointed to one of the photos. "She disappeared from our firm 3 weeks ago. Police said she'd quit suddenly and moved away." The implications hit hard. How many other disappearances had been wrongly classified? How many victims had slipped through the cracks because someone inside law enforcement helped cover their tracks? As if reading the room's tension, the dog moved to the center of the group, its presence somehow both calming and alerting. It had already proved its instincts were worth trusting. "We need a name for him," Lisa said, watching the dog. "He's part of this investigation now." Sarah wiped her eyes and managed a small smile. "Hero," she said softly, "because that's what he is." The name stuck immediately, feeling right to everyone present. But even as they welcomed this four-legged ally to their team, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled onto something that would change not just their careers, but their entire understanding of what evil could hide behind Maplewood's peaceful facade. The escaped suspect's threat echoed in his mind. This isn't over. Looking at the evidence surrounding them, at Sarah's haunted eyes, at Hero's vigilant stance, Jake knew they were standing at the edge of a very dark rabbit hole, and they were just getting started. The Maplewood Police Department's social media accounts exploded within hours of the rescue. Someone had captured video of Hero leading officers from the precinct, and by nightfall, the footage had gone viral. Local news vans clogged the streets around the station, their satellite dishes stretching into the darkening sky like mechanical trees. Inside the precinct, Jake sat at his desk, staring at his phone. 17 missed calls from his father. He switched it to silent and turned back to his computer, where dozens of similar cases from neighboring cities filled his screen. Young professionals disappearing, only to have their departures explained away by convenient job transfers or sudden moves. "Your fan club's getting bigger," Lisa said, dropping a stack of printouts on his desk. She nodded toward the window, where a crowd had gathered. Signs reading "Hero saved my daughter" and "Maplewood's guardian angel" bobbed above the heads of the assembled citizens. Hero, now wearing a makeshift police vest, courtesy of the department's canine unit, sat beside Jake's desk, seemingly unimpressed by his newfound fame. "The FBI's digital forensics team cracked the laptop," Lisa continued. "They found communications dating back 18 months. This wasn't just a local operation. They were moving people through multiple cities, using legitimate businesses as fronts." Jake rubbed his temples, fighting a growing headache. "Any leads on our runner?" "Nothing concrete, but his methods match those of a former tactical officer. The way he disappeared in the warehouse. That was professional ghost protocol." Lisa lowered her voice. "Jake, he knew our playbook because he helped write it." The implication hung heavy in the air. Their suspect wasn't just law enforcement trained, he was one of their own. Jake's mind immediately went to his father, retired Deputy Chief Thomas Harmon, and the cases he'd worked before his sudden retirement 3 years ago. A commotion in the hallway interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Chen had arrived with her parents to give her formal statement. The media crews outside surged forward, but uniformed officers held them back. Hero immediately trotted over to Sarah, his tail wagging as she knelt to hug him. "He hasn't left the precinct since we brought him in," Jake explained to the Chens. "Keeps doing rounds, checking on everyone. The canine unit wants to officially train him." Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Without him, without you and Detective Tran." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Mr. Chen squeezed his wife's shoulder, his other hand extended toward Jake. "Our daughter told us everything," Mr. Chen said. "How can we ever repay you?" Jake shook the offered hand. "Just help us spread the word. There are other victims out there, other families wondering what happened to their loved ones. The more people know about this operation, the harder it'll be for them to continue." As if on cue, Captain Martinez emerged from his office. "Harmon, Tran, my office." Now, inside the captain's office, the FBI's preliminary report lay open on the desk. "They've connected our warehouse to 6 other suspected trafficking sites," Martinez said without preamble. "All within a 100-mile radius, all using the same forged documentation setup. The same tattoo keeps showing up," Lisa added, pulling up photos on her tablet. 3 circles, 1 line. "It's some kind of membership mark." Jake's stomach churned. He'd seen that tattoo before, years ago, in one of his father's case files. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Late nights at the kitchen table, his father obsessing over surveillance photos, muttering about corruption in the ranks. Then the sudden retirement, the drinking, the wall of silence between them. "Jake," Lisa's voice pulled him back. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," he lied. But Hero, who had slipped into the office behind them, let out a low whine. The dog's uncanny ability to read human emotions was becoming almost unnerving. "There's something else," Martinez said, sliding a folder across his desk. Sarah Chen wasn't their first target from Maplewood Financial. 3 other employees have relocated in the past year. All young women, all with access to the company's transaction systems. They're not just trafficking people, Jake realized. They're building a network of forced labor. Accountants, bankers, people who can move money without raising flags. And someone's protecting them, Lisa finished. Someone with enough influence to make investigations disappear. The weight of it all pressed down on Jake's shoulders. His father had seen this coming, had tried to stop it, and had paid the price. Now the same shadow was looming over their investigation, over their city. Outside the captain's office, the crowd of supporters had grown. Local business owners were offering rewards for information. Community watch groups were organizing extra patrols. Hero's simple act of courage had awakened something in Maplewood. A determination to fight back, to protect their own. But as Jake watched the community rally, his phone buzzed again. His father's name flashed on the screen, alongside a text message that made his blood run cold. "You're opening doors that were sealed for a reason. We need to talk, now." The past he'd been running from was finally catching up, and this time, there would be no easy escape. The question was, could he face his own demons while helping the city face its darkness? Hero pressed against his leg, those intelligent eyes seeming to say, "You're not alone in this fight." And maybe that was what Jake needed most to remember, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust someone else to help you carry the burden. The Brass Lantern was exactly the kind of bar retired cops gravitated toward. Dark wood, dim lights, and enough background noise to make eavesdropping difficult. Jake found his father in a corner booth, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. Thomas Harmon had aged since Jake last saw him, his once commanding presence diminished but not gone. "You should have stayed away from the warehouse case," Thomas said without preamble as Jake slid into the booth. "Some doors need to stay closed." "Like you did." Jake couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. "Is that why you walked away?" "Because it was easier to close the door." Thomas's fingers tightened around his glass. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. This goes higher than you can imagine. They don't just destroy careers, Jake. They destroy families. 3 women disappeared before Sarah Chen, Jake said, leaning forward. How many disappeared during your investigation? How many families are still wondering what happened to their daughters? The old man's face hardened. I did what I could. I tried to fight them through proper channels. You know what happened. My informants started dying in accidents. My evidence disappeared from lockup. Then one day, I found pictures of you in my mail. Pictures taken through your apartment window. Jake felt the weight of his father's words, but the anger wouldn't subside. So you quit, walked away, started drinking. I quit because they gave me a choice. Thomas's voice cracked. My badge or my son's life. Don't you dare judge me until you've made that choice. Their conversation was interrupted by Jake's phone buzzing. A text from Lisa. Channel 7 breaking news. Now. The bar's TV was already tuned to the local news. A reporter stood outside Maplewood Financial Services, her expression grave. Sources confirm that Jessica Morris, previously thought to have relocated for work, has been found deceased in a storage facility in Carson City. Police are investigating possible connections to a human trafficking ring recently uncovered in Maplewood. The bar fell silent. Jake's phone buzzed again. Captain Martinez calling an emergency briefing. But Thomas grabbed his arm before he could leave. Listen to me, his father said, suddenly looking every bit the decorated detective he'd once been. The tattoo you found. 3 circles, 1 line. It's called the Trinity Mark. It's not just a gang sign. It's a brand. Everyone who wears it has blood on their hands. They've killed to earn it. Why are you telling me this now? Because, Thomas said, finally taking a drink, they're going to try to stop you the same way they stopped me. Only this time, they're desperate. The warehouse was sloppy. Hero wasn't part of their plan. You've exposed them, and they don't handle exposure well. Back at the precinct, the mood was grim. Hero, who had been dozing under Jake's desk, immediately sensed the tension. The dog moved from person to person, as if checking on the team, before settling next to Lisa's desk. Jessica Morris was tortured, Lisa reported, her voice professionally detached, but her hands shaking slightly as she pulled up the preliminary report. They wanted banking codes, access to international accounts. When she refused, they made an example of her. Jake finished, his father's warnings echoing in his mind. Where's Sarah Chen? Safe house outside the city. FBI protection detail. Martinez looked up from his phone. And you're not going to like this. We found similar cases in every city where Maplewood Financial has a branch. All ruled suicides or relocations. The community's response to Hero's story had forced the trafficking ring into the open. But it had also made them dangerous. The once shadowy operation was now front-page news, and cornered predators were always the most lethal. There's something else, Lisa said, pulling up surveillance footage. Remember the runner from the warehouse? Facial recognition got a partial match from a traffic camera. You need to see this. The grainy image showed their suspect entering a building, the same building where Thomas Harmon now lived. Jake felt the floor tilt beneath him. His father's words took on new meaning. They don't just destroy careers, they destroy families. Hero suddenly stood, hackles raised, staring at the precinct entrance. Through the glass doors, Jake could see a black SUV pulling up, men in suits emerging. FBI, but something about their approach set off warning bells. Lisa, Jake said quietly, run those agents' credentials, now. As Lisa's fingers flew across her keyboard, Jake remembered something else his father had said. Everyone who wears it has blood on their hands. He found himself wondering how many people in law enforcement, people they were supposed to trust, wore that mark hidden under their sleeves. The weight of his service weapon felt reassuring against his side, but Jake knew that in this fight, badges and guns might not be enough. They were up against something that had infiltrated the very systems designed to stop them. Hero moved to stand between the approaching agents and Jake's team, his posture alert but calm. Whatever came through those doors, they would face it together. The question was, how do you fight an enemy that wears your own uniform? The FBI agents were halfway across the precinct floor when Lisa's voice cut through the tension. Credentials don't match. These aren't FBI. Jake's hand moved to his weapon, but before anyone could react, Hero charged forward, barking with an intensity that stopped the imposters in their tracks. The chaos that followed happened in snapshots of motion. Uniformed officers drawing weapons, the fake agents reaching into their jackets, and Martinez's voice booming through the precinct. Police hands where we can see them. The imposters exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Then the one in front smiled, a cold, calculating expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Just delivering some paperwork," he said smoothly, producing an envelope. "Federal Oversight Review of the Chen case. We'll reschedule." They backed out slowly, professionally, but Jake caught a glimpse of something under one man's cuff. 3 interlocked circles with a line through them. "They're getting bolder," Lisa said once the precinct had settled. "Walking right into a police station with fake credentials. They're either desperate or confident." Martinez called an immediate department-wide meeting in the conference room. As officers filed in, Hero positioned himself by the door, watching each person enter with unusual intensity. Jake noticed the dog's behavior change subtly with certain officers. A slight bristling, a low growl, a fixed stare. "Write down every name," Jake whispered to Lisa. "Everyone." Hero reacted at Martinez. Didn't waste time once everyone was seated. "As of now, we have a security breach. All case files related to the Chen rescue and subsequent investigation are to be moved to secure servers. All communications go through encrypted channels only. Trust no one outside this room." A senior detective, Harris, spoke up. "With all due respect, Captain, isn't this overkill? We caught 2 perps, saved the girl. Case closed." Jake watched Hero's reaction. The dog's ears flattened slightly at Harris's voice. "Case closed." Lisa stood, her voice sharp. "Jessica Morris is dead. 3 other women are still missing. And 2 men just walked in here with fake FBI credentials. This isn't over. It's escalating." Martinez nodded. "Detective Tran is right. We're implementing new security protocols. Everyone gets vetted, including existing personnel. No exceptions." The room erupted in protests. Jake scanned the faces, noting who argued loudest against the security measures. Hero's earlier reactions were making more sense now. After the meeting, Jake found himself in Martinez's office with Lisa. The list of officers Hero had reacted to lay on the desk between them. 5 names, Martinez said quietly. "All long-term veterans. All with access to sensitive information. All connected to cases where victims relocated without warning," Lisa added, pulling up personnel files. Harris handled the initial report when Jessica Morris disappeared. Jake thought about his father's warning. How deep did this go? How many officers had been compromised, either through bribes or threats? A commotion outside drew their attention. Sarah Chen had arrived unannounced, her FBI protection detail nowhere in sight. Hero immediately ran to her, but his posture was tense, defensive. "They found me," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "The safe house. Someone leaked the location. They came in the middle of the night. The FBI agents protecting me." She pulled up her sleeve, revealing bruises. They just stood there and watched. Jake felt sick. The Trinity Mark's influence reached into federal law enforcement too. No wonder his father had given up. How do you fight an enemy that's embedded in the very system meant to protect people? "New safe house," Martinez decided. "Off the books. My sister's cabin in the mountains. No paper trail, no digital footprint. They'll be watching us," Lisa warned. "They'll follow anyone who leaves the precinct." Jake looked at Hero, remembering how this all started, with a dog who somehow knew exactly who to trust. An idea formed. "Then we give them something to watch. A convoy, multiple vehicles, all heading in different directions. They can't follow everyone. While Sarah goes out through the old service tunnel under the building, Lisa caught on. It hasn't been used in years. It's not even on current blueprints. Martinez nodded slowly. We do this now, before our leak can alert anyone. He looked at the list of suspected officers. And we feed different information to different people. See which version reaches the wrong ears. As they planned the operation, Jake's phone buzzed with another message from his father. Watch the money. Maurice didn't die because she refused to help. She died because she saw where the accounts led. All roads lead to the top. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, but it was a pattern that threatened everything Jake believed in. If they were right, if the Trinity Mark had truly infiltrated law enforcement at every level, then they weren't just fighting criminals. They were fighting the very institution they'd sworn to serve. Hero pressed against Jake's leg, those intelligent eyes seeming to say what everyone was thinking. In a world where badges couldn't be trusted, sometimes the only loyalty you can count on comes from those with nothing to gain and everything to lose. The next few hours would prove just how right that instinct was. The decoy operation went into motion as dusk settled over Maplewood. 6 police vehicles left the precinct in different directions, their lights dark, each carrying an officer who matched Sarah's general description from a distance. Meanwhile, Sarah, Jake, and Hero made their way through the musty service tunnel beneath the station, guided by Lisa's voice through encrypted earpieces. Multiple vehicles tailing our decoys, Lisa reported. Black SUV following Martinez north, sedan on Chun's tail heading east, motorcycle tracking Watson south. The tunnel's air was thick with decades of disuse. Hero led the way, his white patches barely visible in the beam of Jake's flashlight. The dog moved with certainty, as if he'd mapped this escape route long before they needed it. Your father's name keeps coming up. Lisa's voice crackled through the earpiece. I'm looking at old case files. 3 years ago, he led a task force investigating international money laundering through regional banks. Jake helped Sarah over a fallen beam. What happened to the investigation? Officially, nothing concrete was found. But here's the thing. Every bank involved was eventually acquired by Maplewood Financial's parent company, Global Tech Ventures. The name triggered something in Jake's memory. Sarah, wasn't there a major system upgrade at Maplewood Financial recently? Yes. Sarah's voice shook slightly. Jessica was leading the integration team. She had access to all the legacy systems from the acquired banks. It seemed she had found something strange in the old transaction records. They reached the tunnel's exit, emerging into an abandoned railway station half a mile from the precinct. A single car waited in the shadows, Thomas Harmon behind the wheel. Dad, how did you? Lisa called me. Thomas cut him off. We need to talk, but not here. The cabin's been compromised. I have another place. Hero's reaction surprised everyone. Instead of his usual alertness around strangers, he immediately jumped into the back seat next to Sarah, as if he'd been expecting Thomas all along. As they drove through back roads and side streets, Thomas spoke. Remember Carson Heights? That development project I investigated before my retirement? The one that got shut down over environmental concerns? Those weren't environmental concerns. We found shipping containers there, buried under the construction site, like the ones in your warehouse, but older, full of documentation going back decades. Thomas's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Before I could document everything, the site was bulldozed. Ordered by a judge who retired to a private island the next day, they pulled up to an old hunting lodge deep in the woods. Thomas's former partner, retired Detective Mike Sullivan, met them at the door. His face was grim. Got your message, Sullivan said. You were right about Globotic. Their shell companies match the money trails from our old cases, but it goes deeper. He led them to a room where the walls were covered with photos, documents, and connecting threads. 3 years of investigation conducted in secret. The Trinity Mark isn't just a trafficking operation, Sullivan explained. It's a cleanup crew. When banks or businesses get too close to exposing the money laundering, the Mark steps in. They don't just silence people, they replace them. Sarah gasped. The relocations. They're not just making people disappear. They're putting their own people in position, Jake finished. How many employees at Maplewood Financial are actually Trinity Mark plants? Hero moved around the room, sniffing the documents. He stopped at a particular photograph, pawing at it insistently. It showed a charity gala from 2 years ago, with Maplewood's elite in attendance. In the background, barely noticeable, was a face Jake recognized. The man who had escaped from the warehouse. "That's Richard Knox," Thomas said quietly. "Former Special Forces, then FBI, then private security. He was my partner on the Carson Heights case before Sullivan. The day the containers were discovered, he disappeared. A week later, the threats against you started. The pieces clicked into place. He's not just working for them," Jake realized. "He's recruiting, using his law enforcement connections to identify officers they can turn." Sullivan nodded. "Ambition, debt, family problems. They find leverage points. Some they bribe, others they blackmail. The smart ones figure out it's better to look the other way." "But why Maplewood?" Sarah asked. "Why here?" Thomas pulled out a map marked with shipping routes. "Because Maplewood is perfect. Mid-sized city, well-connected, but not too high-profile, multiple transport routes, and a police force small enough to infiltrate, but big enough to provide cover." Hero suddenly tensed, ears forward. Outside, gravel crunched under tires. "Back door," Sullivan whispered, drawing a weapon. "Now." But before they could move, red and blue lights flooded the windows. A familiar voice came through a megaphone. "This is Detective Harris. We know you're in there. Come out with your hands up." Jake met his father's eyes. "How did they find us?" Thomas looked sick. "Because I led them here. They still have the pictures, Jake. They still have the leverage." Hero growled, not at Thomas, but at Sullivan, who was now holding his weapon on them. "I'm sorry," Sullivan said, his sleeve riding up to reveal the Trinity mark. "But everyone has a price. You of all people should understand that, Tom." As Jake reached for his weapon, he realized that in a conspiracy this deep, sometimes the biggest betrayals come from those closest to you. The question now wasn't just who to trust, but whether anyone could be trusted at all. Jake's mind raced through options as Sullivan's weapon remained trained on them. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, while Thomas stood frozen, the weight of his betrayal visible in his posture. Only Hero seemed completely focused, his muscles coiled and ready. "You don't understand," Thomas broke the silence. "I thought I could fix this. Get enough evidence to bring it all down at once." Sullivan promised. Sullivan promised what, Dad? That he'd protect me if you helped him. Jake's voice was sharp, while more women disappeared, while Jessica Morris died. Outside, Harris's voice boomed again. "Last warning. We have the building surrounded." Sullivan gestured with his weapon. "Move. Front door." Slowly, but Hero had other plans. In a movement so quick it seemed rehearsed, the dog launched himself at the ceiling light, plunging the room into darkness. The momentary chaos was all Jake needed. He tackled Sullivan, their impact sending both men crashing into the evidence wall. Photos and documents rained down around them. Sarah screamed as gunshots lit up the darkness. Through the window, Jake glimpsed officers approaching, but their movements were wrong, too aggressive for a standard police operation. These weren't cops coming to help. They were Trinity Mark enforcers wearing police uniforms. "The tunnels," Sullivan shouted through the darkness. "There in the hunting lodge tunnels." Jake felt his heart sink. Of course, an old hunting lodge would have escape tunnels, and now Sullivan had just exposed their potential escape route. But then he heard his father's voice, strong and clear. "Southeast corner, old bootlegger's exit." More shots fired through the windows. Jake felt Sarah's hand grip his jacket. "He's lying," she whispered. "Look at Hero." The dog was scratching frantically at a section of floorboards in the opposite direction from where Thomas had indicated. Jake understood immediately. His father was trying to buy them time, sending Sullivan's backup to the wrong location. Detective Harmon, Harris's voice carried through the chaos. Closer now. Think about your career, about your future. There's a place for you in the organization. Your father made the smart choice. Now, it's your turn. Jake used the voice as cover, moving toward Hero's position. The dog's claws had exposed a metal ring in the floor. Sarah helped him pull, revealing a narrow passage heading down. They're getting in. Sullivan's voice held a note of triumph. The front door burst open, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. But Jake had already helped Sarah into the passage. He turned back for his father, only to see Thomas grappling with Sullivan. "Go," Thomas shouted. "I'll hold them off." "Dad, I failed you once," Thomas grunted, maintaining his grip on Sullivan. "Not again. Go." Hero didn't wait for further discussion. The dog pushed Jake toward the passage with surprising strength. The last thing Jake saw before dropping down was his father throwing Sullivan into the approaching officers, buying precious seconds. The passage was narrow, forcing them to move in single file. Hero took the lead, his white patches serving as a guide through the darkness. Behind them, gunshots and shouts became muffled, then faded entirely. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, they emerged into a drainage culvert. Sarah's phone buzzed. A message from Lisa using their encrypted channel. "Got your GPS ping. Coming to you. Martinez has called in state police. Don't trust local frequencies." "Your father," Sarah said softly. "He sacrificed himself." "Maybe," Jake replied, checking his weapon. "Or maybe he finally chose a side." He looked at Hero, who had positioned himself as a sentry at the culvert entrance. "But right now, we have something they don't expect." "What's that?" "Evidence." Jake pulled out his phone, showing Sarah the screen. During the chaos, he'd activated the body camera that Lisa had insisted he wear. Sullivan's confession, Harris's offer, their faces, their voices, all recorded. And most importantly, he reached down to scratch Hero's ears. "We have a witness. They can't intimidate or bribe." Hero's ears suddenly perked up. In the distance, they could hear sirens. Lots of them, but the dog's posture remained relaxed, suggesting these were friendlies approaching. "Jake." Sarah's voice was thoughtful. "At the bank, before all this, Jessica wasn't just looking at transaction records. She found something in the pattern of acquisitions. Every bank Global Tech bought had something in common. They all handled accounts for a company called Trinity Holdings." The pieces started shifting in Jake's mind. They're not just using the banks to move money. They own the banks. The whole financial network is one big shell game, Sarah finished. "And I think I know where Jessica hid the proof." Hero barked once, tail wagging. Through the trees, they could see Lisa's car approaching, followed by state police vehicles. The real fight was just beginning, but for the first time since the warehouse, Jake felt like they might have a chance. The Trinity, Mark had spent years building their shadow empire on secrets and fear, but they had never counted on their perfect system being disrupted by something as simple as a stray dog's moral compass. State police established a secure perimeter around an abandoned ranger station 20 miles outside Maplewood. Inside, Jake, Lisa, Sarah, and Martinez huddled around a laptop, while Hero kept watch at the door. The dog's behavior had become their most reliable security system. Jessica was smarter than they realized, Sarah explained, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She didn't just find their pattern, she created a backup system they never detected. Every time they made her process a suspicious transaction, she left a marker. The screen filled with transaction logs, each tagged with an innocuous code that meant nothing to casual observers. But Sarah showed them the pattern, dates, amounts, and routing numbers that painted a picture of money moving through an elaborate maze of shell companies. "Look at this," Lisa pointed. "Every major deposit corresponds with a reported disappearance. They're not just trafficking people, they're selling access to the financial system itself." Martinez's phone buzzed. "Thomas Harmon is in custody," he reported. "State police picked him up along with Sullivan and 3 others. He's asking to talk, but only to Jake. Jake felt the weight of all eyes on him. Hero padded over, resting his head on Jake's knee, a gesture that had become his way of saying, "You're not alone in this. There's something else," Sarah said quietly. "Jessica didn't just track the money. The night before she disappeared, she sent me an encrypted email. I didn't understand it then, but now." She pulled up the message, showing a series of seemingly random numbers and letters. Coordinates, Jake realized. She broke it into pieces so it wouldn't be recognized. The coordinates led to an old church on the outskirts of town. The basement was used as a document repository for local banks in the 1980s. Lisa read from her research. "It's been abandoned since the digital conversion, but the old records would still be there," Jake finished. "Physical proof that can't be hacked or deleted." Martinez made the decision. "We move now, while we have surprise on our side. State police will coordinate with Hero's." Sudden growl cut him off. The dog's attention was fixed on Martinez's phone. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked. But he already suspected. He turned to Martinez. "Who did you just text?" The captain's face remained professional, but something shifted in his eyes. Standard protocol, keeping the chain of command informed. The same chain of command that's been compromised. Lisa's hand moved to her weapon, the same one that knew about the safe house. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Hero's growl deepened, and Martinez slowly raised his hands. "You don't understand," he said. "They have my daughter, have had her for months. The postcards, the phone calls saying she's enjoying her study abroad program. They made me choose. Like they made my father choose," Jake said, the pieces finally fitting together. "How many others, Captain? How many good cops forced to look the other way because they threatened their families?" "More than you know," Martinez's voice cracked. "But I left something out of that text. Something important. Because maybe it's time someone chose differently." Jake's phone vibrated. A message from his father, sent through the state police. "The church is a trap. Real records are at Carson Heights. Construction never stopped. It just went underground. Hero knows. He was there." The dog's reaction to the message was immediate. He ran to the door, scratching urgently. "Jake," Sarah called from the laptop. Jessica's email had a second part. "Look at how the numbers align with the bank's construction date. Carson Heights wasn't just a development project. It was their archive," Jake said. "Everything they didn't want found, buried under concrete and environmental citations. That's why they needed my father out of the way." Lisa was already gathering gear. "If we move fast, we can." "No," Martinez interrupted. "You don't understand my text. They'll be moving everything right now, destroying evidence, covering tracks. We couldn't get within a mile of Carson Heights." Hero barked once, sharp and insistent. "Unless," Jake said slowly, "that's exactly what we want them to do. Dad didn't just give up 3 years ago. He was playing a longer game." He turned to Martinez. "Captain, how badly do you want your daughter back?" Understanding dawned in Martinez's eyes. "What do you need?" "One last betrayal," Jake said. "But this time, we choose the target." The plan came together quickly. Martinez would maintain his cover, reporting their movements exactly as the Trinity Mark would expect. Meanwhile, Jake had another stop to make. The state police holding facility was cold and sterile. Thomas Harmon sat across from his son, looking older than his years, but somehow more at peace than Jake had seen him in a long time. "Carson Heights," Jake said without preamble. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you? About the tunnels, the records, all of it." Thomas nodded slowly. "I knew we'd only get one shot. Had to wait until they thought they'd won, until their network was so big they got sloppy. Hero, he was there the day we found the first containers. Must have been a pup then, living in the tunnels. He saw everything, and now, Thomas smiled slightly. "Now we remind them why you don't build your empire in someone else's backyard." As if on cue, Hero padded into the room, having somehow convinced the state police to let him through. The dog looked between father and son, tail wagging slowly. "Time to finish what you started, old friend," Thomas said to the dog. "Show them what you found." The citywide awareness event for trafficking prevention drew hundreds to Maplewood's Central Plaza. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metal trees. Hero, wearing a custom canine vest, sat proudly on the makeshift stage, while speakers praised his role in uncovering the trafficking ring. But the real operation was happening beneath the surface. Construction crews moving into Carson Heights. Lisa's voice crackled through Jake's earpiece. "Just like Martinez's tip suggested, they're bringing in heavy equipment." Jake watched from his position near the plaza's edge as Richard Knox slipped through the crowd, his casual business attire blending perfectly with the gathering of concerned citizens. The former FBI agent's face showed no concern. Why should it? According to Martinez's intelligence, the police were focused on the church location. Multiple vehicles entering the Carson Heights site. Sarah reported from her secure location in the State Police Command Center. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore. They think they've won. Knox reached the stage just as the mayor began her speech about community vigilance. Hero's ears twitched, but he maintained his pose, playing the role of celebrated canine hero perfectly. "Target is in position," Jake murmured into his mic. "Dad, you ready?" "Like you said." Thomas's voice was clear and strong. "Time to remind them why you don't build your empire in someone else's backyard." The operation hinged on a simple truth. The Trinity Mark had spent so long corrupting the system that they'd forgotten about the people they'd hurt along the way. People who'd been waiting for a chance to fight back. At precisely 2 p.m., a series of events unfolded simultaneously. The construction crews at Carson Heights broke through to the underground archive, exactly where they believed the incriminating records were stored. Instead, they found state police tactical teams waiting in the tunnels that Hero had helped map out days before. At the plaza, Knox received an urgent text about the Carson Heights raid. But when he tried to warn his associates, he found the cellular network mysteriously down, courtesy of Sarah's banking colleagues who'd chosen to stand with her. And as Knox turned to leave, he found himself facing not just Jake and Lisa, but dozens of citizens who'd been quietly positioned throughout the crowd. Parents of missing girls, former employees forced out of their jobs, cops who'd been pressured to look the other way, all wearing body cameras, all streaming to secure servers. "It's over, Knox," Jake said, loud enough for nearby media to hear. "Carson Heights, the banking records, all of it. Going to be hard to cover this up with so many cameras around." Knox's hand twitched toward his jacket, but Hero was faster. The dog leaped from the stage, crossing the space in seconds. Knox found himself facing an angry German Shepherd mix with absolutely no intention of backing down. "You know what your mistake was," Jake continued, aware of the news cameras now turning their way. "You thought fear was enough, that if you threatened enough people, hurt enough families, everyone would stay quiet. But you forgot something important about small towns." Lisa stepped forward, handcuffs ready. "We protect our own." The plaza erupted in controlled chaos as state police moved in, arresting not just Knox, but several prominent citizens. In the crowd, each wearing the Trinity Mark hidden beneath expensive clothes. At Carson Heights, the underground archive yielded decades of evidence. Trafficking routes, banking records, blackmail material used to control officials. But more importantly, it contained something the Trinity Mark never expected: hope for the families of the missing. "Jake," Sarah's voice was excited over the comms. "We found Jessica's full database. She hid it in the old backup servers. Names, dates, locations, everything they didn't want found. We can bring them all home." Martinez, his daughter, now safe in state police protection, coordinated with federal authorities who hadn't been compromised. The Trinity Mark's network began to unravel. each arrest leading to more revelations. Thomas Harmon, watching from a state police vehicle, finally allowed himself to smile. "You did good, son," he said when Jake approached. "Both of you," he added, reaching down to scratch Hero's ears. "We all did," Jake replied. "Sometimes the longest way around is the shortest way home." Hero barked in agreement, then suddenly tensed, nose lifting to the air. Before anyone could react, the dog bolted toward a news van at the edge of the plaza. Inside, they found a hidden room filled with surveillance equipment and a very surprised observer wearing the Trinity mark. Even now, Lisa marveled, securing the new prisoner. He's still finding them. Jake looked at the growing crowd of citizens sharing stories, supporting each other, refusing to be silenced any longer. The Trinity mark had built their power on isolation and fear, never understanding that their greatest weakness was the very community they sought to control. Hero sat beside him, alert but relaxed, as if to say his work here was finally done. The stray who had wandered into their lives had not only exposed a criminal empire, but had reminded an entire town of something vital. True strength isn't found in shadows and threats, but in the courage to stand together in the light. And in Maplewood, that light was finally breaking through.